that simply say, you are an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe.
I ask you to read Calvin's little booklet, and he tells us right at the outset that holiness is what it is all about. Scripture is the simple rule of life. Only if we walk in the beauty of God's law do we become sure of our adoption as children of the Father. You see how badly Calvinism gets treated. The classical treatment in scholarship is that Calvinism said you are among the elect if you are prosperous. And that's what gave rise to capitalism in its European form. Would you believe it? Of course, they can't touch this. Holiness is the key principle. Page 17. Be holy because I am holy. When we hear any mention of our mystical union with Christ, you mean Calvin talked about that? Ooh, sounds like mysticism. We should remember that holiness is the channel to it. Holiness is not a merit by which we can attain communion with God, but a gift of Christ which enables us to cling to Him and to follow Him. Holiness means full obedience to Christ. Now that's what we've been talking about. And how you do that. Orderly systems of morality show us no more excellent plan than to obey and follow Christ. Calvin was very conscious of the alternatives to Christianity. He was a well-educated man, deeply immersed in the classics. And when you read him, he's constantly referring to the alternatives and contrasting them. And he was very much aware that there was nothing to compare with the teaching about morality. Now, I want to come back to that a little later because Calvin takes a beating. You know, Calvinism did not become an incredible world-beating movement by emphasizing the 5 points. It became a world-beating movement because it brought incredible life to people in all kinds of situations. And that is the heart of Calvinism. And this is actually a section out of the Institutes. And in the Institutes, the third part is dealing with the Christian life. And he says, I'll give it to you in one word: self-denial. The Christian life is self-denial, and he moves here into that. And it's possible to misunderstand that badly, but Calvin didn't misunderstand it badly. He got it right, and we can get it right too. You're not on your way to holiness except through self-denial. Now, we sang about putting our crowns at the feet of Jesus. What does that mean practically to you? Is that something we can only sing about? Or is it something we can actually do? And what would it be if we did it? Right. What do crowns represent?
Kingdoms.
Who said that?
Kingdoms.
Kingdom. Crowns represent kingdom. So if I put my crown at the feet of Jesus, what am I putting at his disposal? My kingdom. See, that's what I'm doing. That's self-denial. In the form that opens genuine life to you. because you lay down an incomplete life and it becomes complete in the life of God. Mystical union with Christ is not very mystical. It's very practical. And that's the way it's always been understood by the people who understood it and were able to live it and bring it as a vital force into the world. Now, we have been talking about the human side of holiness. And we're going to keep talking about it, and we'll get more and more practical about it as we come to the end. But you have to get the concepts right. If you don't, it won't work. There's nothing more practical than a good idea. And the bad ones are devastating. They are devastating. And so we have to start out with understanding the kingdom of God, the gospel. We need to understand what we're to be doing as followers of Christ and as disciples of Christ. And so we have been talking about that. And I have told you that my intention is to bring you to the point to where you could realistically propose, if you're not already there, you may be there, and that's wonderful if you are, you could realistically propose to teach someone to do the things that Jesus said. And I hope you, at this point, feel that if you did not do that, you would be an irresponsible disciple. But then we need to learn how to do it. And our discussions from beginning to end are directed to the things that, in my judgment and my experience, would help us actually do that. So you start by making disciples. You don't try to teach someone how to do what Jesus said unless they have become his disciple. And that's a big jump for us. We have to admit that. And a lot of the failure comes from trying to teach people to do the things that Jesus said when they have not agreed to be taught. And so we're concerned to lay a foundation for people becoming disciples. And then when we make them, we gather them. And we gather them in the Trinitarian reality. That's what it means to baptize them in the name. Doesn't mean to get them wet in one way or another while you say the words. Disciples are meant to live in Trinitarian community. It's not a lonely path. It is a path of incredible God-given union with others. And we have to understand that. And you know, this does not happen automatically. It has to be understood, it has to be taught, it has to be fostered. And you may want to put down that while it is true, without me you can do nothing, it's also true that if you do nothing, it will be without him. You have to act. And that's where our problem is. That's why I've taken the theme of the human side of holiness. Now then, as you do that, then you understand how to go about, or you learn how to go about teaching people to do the things that Jesus said. And you understand that you don't give them a list of things to do, a to-do list. You give them a to-be list. Okay. And that's where I put up all the stuff last time about the parts of the self, and we looked at Jesus' teaching of how to go about it, the law that includes everything. Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That's the to-be list. Those are not things you do. Those are ways you stand in life. And today we're going to spend our morning and most of our afternoon just on the idea of love. Because love, in all of the inner dimensions of life, the transformation of all of our main aspects that Jesus mentions. And think for a moment that Jesus knew what he was talking about, that he understood human personality. It is important for Christians occasionally to think of Jesus as someone who had profound and unique knowledge. You may need to find a quiet place and sit down and try to think that thought for a while. Great old text. What think ye of Christ? And actually, that's the whole deal. How do you think about him? And you want to think that when he comes to teach, you're listening to someone who actually is the greatest teacher, the greatest person of knowledge who's ever been on earth. And you may say, well, if he knew so much, why didn't he give Peter and John the relativity equations? Well, he had something much more important for them to deal with. And if you look about you, you might think that we're not ready for those yet. And besides, he'd have had to put them in Roman numerals. That's very hard to work with. You ever tried to multiply in Roman numerals? It's very important to think about Jesus rightly. If you think there is someone smarter than Jesus, you will be their disciple. So when he tells us, well, what is the all-inclusive word? Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That's the great law. That law is more fundamental than any other law. In fact, that law, the law of love, is the one who helps us understand God and to know why there is a universe where the relativity equations apply. Why did God create? Because he is love. What does love do? Love creates what is good. Love is oriented to what is good, always. And what he's saying is when you line yourself up with God in that way, you're lining yourself up with ultimate reality. So now when we start to teach people to do all the things that Jesus said, that is where we have to start. And so we don't begin by focusing just on practices. And one of the great dangers of the, hey, that's not right. Flying upside down here. One of the great dangers of spiritual formation is that it will come to think that spiritual formation is about practices. Not about practices. You don't start with practices. You start with the gospel and coming to understand the nature of God and what God is calling us to and what will give us. And practices come later. And we will We will be going into those as we go into Wednesday and Thursday especially, but spiritual formation is not about spiritual formation. And that I hope you will keep that in mind as you go about your work and as you watch what others are doing, because you will find that many people never get beyond the practices. And sometimes they turn them into legalisms, and then that's killing. That is a killing turn. It's about shaping the inner person. And that's what we spent time talking about, outlining the person, and we will have to come back to that more, especially this afternoon. We'll spend some more time on the body and on the spirit, but we wanted to get the whole picture out in front of you, and then we'll come and go. And the whole person is what we're looking at. And when we shape the inner person, all the dimensions into Christ-likeness, then the outcome is easy, routine obedience. See, when Christ on the cross said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," do you think that was hard for him to do? What do you think, honestly? Think it was hard? No, let me tell you what would have been hard for Jesus to do. What would have been hard for him to do would be to curse the people who were crucifying. He would have had to break out in another sweat to do that. Why? Because that wasn't in him. That wasn't in him. Now, is it hard to do the things that Jesus taught? Yeah, impossible. If that's what you're focusing on, you can't do it. But then again, as we talked yesterday, we'll talk endlessly about it, we're not meant to do it on our own. And the way help comes is not through a sort of little boost as we go about doing the particular thing, but through the transformation of the person. And then, of course, there is additional grace every step of the way, but it's through the transformation of the person. It was easy for Jesus to do what he did in praying for the forgiveness of those guys that crucified him, and you'd better get ready to see them in heaven. Do you think the Father answered his prayer? What do you think? Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. Well, I mean, it's speculation, but you may have to room with one of those guys, or have a house next door to them, or have dinner with them. See, the blessing was in him. Now, just to complete the summary of last time, when we go that route, then actions which come out of the whole person with some degree of emphasis more in one direction or another, because most of our actions do not come from a simple act of will. And sometimes they come in opposition to what we actually do. Yeah. And the illustration that we use, because everyone knows the story, is Peter. He really did intend to die on the spot, not deny the Lord. And he did. And the Lord set it up real good 3 times, and you would have thought the second time around he would have realized what was happening, wouldn't you? Or at least the 3rd time around, but he didn't. That's because all of these factors were at work in him. Thoughts, emotions, the body. Actually, the body and the social were the main sources in Peter's personality of his denial. You can bet he never thought that a little girl would walk up and say, "You're one of those." The social setting, he had no idea what it was going to be like. No doubt he thought it would be a physical confrontation, and he did whop off somebody's ear with a sword. Not evidence of real proficiency in this respect. I mean, you'd really have to be good just to cut off an ear. So if it happens that way, you can bet it didn't have much to do with proficiency. But he wanted to do what he said, but he didn't know what was in him. That was the deal. See, and Jesus was teaching Peter, Satan has desired to sift you like wheat. You sift wheat to get the rocks and the big bugs out of it. And Peter was full of rocks and big bugs. And he didn't know it. He thought he was his intentions. He wasn't. So now why, think about this, see this, because we want the actions to be right. That's important. But what we know and what Jesus teaches us is that if you want the actions to be right, you can't get that just by trying to do right. So if you want to keep the law, don't try to keep the law. A little bit here and there of that won't hurt, but if you become fixated on that, you're dead in the water. You don't try to keep the law, you try to become the kind of person who would keep the law. See, that's where you put your effort. And now we're going to spend most of our morning talking about love. You don't want to try to act lovingly. You don't go to 1 Corinthians 13 and say, well, I'm going to be patient. I'm going to be kind. Well, that's nice, but you won't make it. You have to take love into you and let it grow and dominate you, and then you find out, you are patient. Not because of you, but because of love that is in you. So the object then is to enable us, ourselves, and those we're teaching and working with, to take on love. And now we're going to come back to that. That's the end of the summary. And I remind you that you can ask questions at any point you can get in. So let me know, and I'll find a place, is what I'm saying. Okay, let's look at the verses. 1 John, chapter 4. Verse 7 and following. And we want to read this and one other passage, and then we want to come to 1 Corinthians 13 and spend most of our time there. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. Now that's jacked up the stakes pretty high already, okay? And you have to understand that love is a certain kind of thing. Most of you know that Greek has a number of different terms that gets translated into English as love. we are talking agape love. It's an unusual concept because it really did not have much of an application in life as the Greeks knew it. But now, with the coming of Christ, it gains a new meaning and a new understanding. Love is from God. It's not from how smashing someone looks, for example. And love is, unfortunately, prostituted and beaten up badly. Everyone who loves is born of God. Now, that may shake up your orthodoxy a bit, but don't worry about it. Because once you understand what love is, you'll see how orthodoxy is taken care of. And as I go through this, I'm not going to have time to say all the things I don't mean by what I say, so your questions are going to be important to deal with this. But this is what scares many people and makes them back away from this. Everyone who loves is born of God. Well, didn't so-and-so love? And they don't trust in Jesus and so on. Well, okay, just let that stand there. Everyone who is born of God and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. By this the love of God was manifested in us, that God has sent His only begotten Son into the world so that we might live through Him. This afternoon we talk about life. It's good to see the connection here between life and love. Now with that verse, verse 9, there begins the clarification of what love is. This is the mark. By this the love of God, agape, was manifested, that God sent His only begotten Son into the world so that we might live through Him. He brings us eternal life. And that's a kind of living that we engage in, resurrection life, if you wish. And this is love. Not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God loved us in that way, we also ought to love one another. See, when Jesus is asked, what is the great law? He extends the Shema to include a verse in Leviticus 19. And I think also repeated in 32. You see the references in the sheet that I handed out, if you study that. But there's this obscure thing that shows up way off in the corner. Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't have grudges against your neighbor. Love your neighbor. And then you find a few verses later, love the alien, the stranger. I mean, one of the most absolutely astonishing evidences of the supernatural origin of the law is the stipulation that there will be one law for you, the Jewish people, and for the alien or the stranger. And in Leviticus there, it says, you shall love the foreigner, the alien, as yourself, because you were aliens in Egypt. You know what it's like, baby. So remember that guy standing on the corner, hoping for some work. We ought to love one another. Now, no one has beheld God at any time. That's a familiar theme in John's theology. If we love one another, God abides in us, and His love is perfected in us if we love one another. please try to take in the sweeping nature of these statements. Because only if you see that can you really understand the radical character of the love that he's talking about. And the way he identifies God with love. Verse 16, we have come to know and have believed the love which God has for us. God is love. It's important to understand that love is not God. You cannot say that safely. But many people slip into it. And it is a perversion of what has sort of filtered through to them from their culture. Love is not God. Now, if you've got God is love down well enough, then you can begin to think that other thought, that love is God. But if you do that without getting it down clearly, how God is love and identifies love. Love does not identify God. God identifies love. If you read through, for example, the prayers of the Old Testament and then again in the New, like in the book of Acts, you'll see that God is never addressed as, oh, great love. God is addressed in two ways, creator and covenant maker. That's how God is identified from the finite point of view. Read that marvelous prayer in Nehemiah 9 and see how that, and then watch for this. See, creator and covenant maker. Intervening in history to make covenant. That's how God is identified. And then we come to understand what love is from what God is. So God identifies love. Love does not identify God. And I don't know what it does for you. Maybe you should experiment with it. Try opening your prayers with, oh, great love, and see how it works. Now, loving Father, okay, that does a little more. But you remember Jesus, when he was teaching us to pray, just said, Our Father, who art in heaven. And Father includes both creator, covenant maker, family, acting in history, acting in individual lives. God is love, and the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this love is perfected with us, that we may have confidence in the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we also in this world. They put a little strain on you there, but it's good to have a little strain in the right direction. There's no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear. Now then, you have to fill that in, or you won't be able to understand how perfect love casts out fear. And one of the most essential things that we do in teaching people to do what Jesus said is rid them of fear. You have to bring people into a position where they are without fear before they can walk routinely and easily in what Jesus said. Most lies, for example, are told out of fear of something. A little girl in Sunday school, it is said, was asked, what is a lie? And she replied, it's an abomination to God and a very present help in time of trouble. And if you haven't thrown your crown at the feet of Jesus, you're going to need some help in time of trouble, because if you're running your own kingdom, you have plenty to fear. Yes, ma'am.
Can you just, I'm sure there's plenty, but can you just name some fears?
I'm sorry, say it again.
I'm sure there's plenty, but can you just name some fears? Like what?
Name some fears? Yes, yes, indeed. Some ordinary kinds of fears is, what are people going to think of me? Oh, my hair is in such a mess. You know, so many fears are silly things, the ordinary kinds of things, but they're serious. They're silly, but very serious. And people spend now, more fear of death. That is a fear which Hebrews 2 tells us that people, apart from Christ, all their lives are in bondage to. Fear of death. And we got to talk about that this afternoon, because we have to come back to body and spirit and spend some time on that. Fear of death, fear of sickness, fear of losing all your gitas. Where did your retirement go? Mr. Madoff made off with it. Yeah. The fear of losing your loved ones. So there's a whole range here. And thank you for asking that, because when we're dealing with this stuff, it's so important to be concrete and to think precisely. Now remember, I've already told you what fear is. Fear is anticipation of evil. So each one of us, I'm sure, has a rather unique menagerie of fears in our breast. But then there are the common ones. See, one of the things that you do in helping people come to obey Christ is you teach them that death is nothing to fear. And that's Jesus' teaching, and we'll come back to that. That's a huge problem. Yes, sir?
Contrasting that love, the absence of fear, with the fear of the Lord.
Fear
of the Lord in the Old Testament.
Yeah. Fear of the Lord is like the fear you have when you first hold your baby in your arms and you're afraid you'll drop it. See, there is a fear of something so precious that you're mainly fearing yourself and what you're going to do with it. On the other hand, God is incredibly awesome in terms of his greatness. And you remember when he came down on Sinai and called the Israelites up, he wanted to speak to them, and they said to Moses, "Don't ever let him do that to us again." And there was a standard understanding. To see God is to die. When the parents of Samson saw the angel and finally got convinced he was an angel, they said, "Let's prepare to die." Because they knew about God, and they knew how awesome he was in that sense too. And some things are so great that they overwhelm us. And we should love God in a way that combines our fear of mishandling that and our sense that God is so great that he, use another word, he's terrible. He's terrible. Yes, sir.
A.W. Tozer has said that the fear of the Lord is an incredible feeling of insufficiency in the presence of Almighty God.
That's good. That's good. And the natural response is, that's actually humility, because you are aware of your dependence and because of your insufficiency. Yes, ma'am, and yes, sir. Justice.
Is it possible to love God before we truly understand that we ourselves are not?
No, I don't think so. I think you have to go through that. And loving God is not something you just decide to do one day. Love in general is something you grow into, and you have to be willing to do it. And that's why God approaches humanity and individuals in the way he does, is to allow them the room to grow into love for him. I mean, we've just come through Christmas, and there's a lot of silliness attached to it, but the idea of Christ coming in the way he did, illegitimately, to a little peasant girl, getting dragged around the country on a donkey, perhaps, laid in a cow stall. That's so magnificent in showing the approach. Or I often think, like after the resurrection, man, would I have ever showed up to Caiaphas. So let's have that conversation again. You know. But he didn't do that. He appeared to those who had been prepared. Preparation is the key. And indeed, most of human history is best seen as preparation. And the individual comes very much in that same way. Well, I'll never get through this passage if I don't move on. Verse 19, I want to come back to perfect love casts out fear in a moment. We love because he first loved us. Now that, of course, that's standard. Understanding, we don't know how to love until we see it and receive it from God. We learn that love is safe. Most people do not trust love, and they can't love because of that. And so they have to learn that love is safe. It takes care of business. Someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he's a liar. No, I'm glad John said this, and I didn't say it. Helps a lot. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also. Now, loving your brother pulls on your resources, and your resources for love comes from, first, the knowledge that you are loved by God. That makes it safe for you to love others. I forgot you. I'll be with you in just a second. By this we know we love the children of God when we love God and observe his commandments. Now, you have to get the commandments in on love. There is not an opposition between them. The relationship between them is very simple. When you love, you do what the commandments say. That's what Paul says, isn't it? At the end of, what is it, Romans 10 or 13, I forget which right now. He that loveth hath fulfilled the law. The connection between the commandments and love is very simple. First of all, the commandments are a gift of God's love. He gives them to us because he loves us. They are a part of grace. Law is not opposed to grace except in the one case where you attempt to use the law to justify yourself. That's the only case. And otherwise, the law and grace go right together, because the law is, among other things, a manifestation of grace. And if you do succeed in keeping the law, it will be because of God's accompanying grace. Just a couple of more verses. This is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. You remember the story of Rachel and Jacob, and how Jacob had a little switcheroo pulled on him, and he had to promise to serve 7 more years for Rachel, and you remember the wording there, it was as if they were nothing. Try to remember that one phrase, his commandments are not burdensome. I like the old translation, they are not grievous. The law is good. And read Psalm 19 to help you fill in the blanks on that. Whoever is born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith. Which faith? The faith in what he has just been talking about. Now, John, of course, is sort of the last of the theologians in the New Testament, and he's had longer to experience the walk with Christ than anyone. And God no doubt picked him because he was the kid in the apostles, and for other good reasons. How would you complete this verse? This is the message we heard from Jesus. How would you complete that? Can any of you say it out loud? What was the message? John 1:1. This is the message we heard of him, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Now, is that gospel? What do you think? Can you preach that? I wouldn't preach that to people who hadn't already heard about Jesus, because they wouldn't know what I was saying. And they might say dumb things like, oh, I've got light. Like people say dumb things, oh, I've got love. But when you hear about Jesus, then you want to understand that that's what the apostles heard. That's what God is light. In him there is no darkness, none. None at all. Nothing in God to fear. Awesome, yes, but not something to make you fearful, unless you're set against him. When you're with him, then God is all light. See, that John gets the message. Now then, in the Gospel of John, in the 13th chapter, you find this statement about love. Verse 34, a new commandment I give you. Now, John, you remember, when he picks that up in the letter, says it's an old commandment also. Because actually the way it came was not new. But it was new in what it meant. And so Jesus is saying, a new commandment I give you, that you love others as you love yourself. Is that what it said? Well, actually, he did say that in some places, didn't he? Like in Matthew 7. And elsewhere, love your neighbor as yourself. But see, if that's all you have to go on, actually you might not love yourself, and probably you don't, and you wouldn't know what loving yourself meant. And so if you try to love your neighbor as yourself, and that's all you've got to go on, you and your neighbor are both in bad shape. Okay? And that's actually what we see around us in the world. So Jesus comes back and says, love one another as I have loved you. Jesus redefines love. Even as I have loved you, that you love one. Notice he does not say, love everybody. If you find someone that loves everyone, congratulate them and tell them they're approximating to divinity. You'll do well if you can love 2 or 3 people, depending on your position. He didn't say love everybody. Love one another in the fellowship of disciples. Now, obviously, there is more to be said, but you understand, and you should love your neighbors, you love yourself, and hope that you can bring to that relationship the kind of love you see here. But this is a church, a community of disciples should be a school of love. And the reason why churches are places where you have a lot of people who don't like one another and disagree with one another is so they can learn to love one another. The Christians are supposed to love one another, and if you go to church, you'll find others to love, and among them will be a few enemies. And that's just the time to stay, not the time to go. Because a church is a place where you come to love and be loved. And that's a learning process. Now that involves many things which we can't go into at this point. But verse 35, by this shall all men know that you are Presbyterians, Baptists, Christians. No, none of that. Disciples. By this people shall. Now, how can Jesus say that? You will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Because the quality of the love that he teaches is so radical that he knows you can't get it anywhere else. Now that's crucial in our world today to understand that. Because we have all sorts of people saying, well, we can be Christians and do this and that and the other. Oh, okay. Maybe you can. Depends on how you identify Christians. Jesus is talking about his students or his apprentices. And he is saying, you can count on it. I have a lot of young people who come to USC, Christians, and they may come in to me after a little while and say, you know, the people here are more loving than the people in my church at home. Now, actually, there's a great deal to work through there for them. But I normally, in one way or another, come to the point of saying, well, just give it a little time. Give it a little time and see how that works out. The kind of love that Jesus gives to his disciples is not something that people can produce from human resources. They will do their best to define something that they can pass off as that, if you haven't forgotten everything.
Yeah, the question had to do with the, just the statement of love is not God, but God is love. I was wondering, what would be the concern with reversing it? And,
yes, thank you.
And then, would that
right.
weaken,
right.
Is there love outside of God is the question, and is it in our definition of love where the disconnect is, or, so those are kind of the lines.
Yes, no, that's excellent. The problem is what people bring to love and then identify with God. So for those of you young people will not remember, there was a movie some years ago called Bob and Ted and Carol and Alice. And it had the song in it, what the world needs now is love, sweet love. I won't bore you with the details of the movie, but let us say it had very little to do with actual love. See, people in the world confuse love with all kinds of other things, especially with feelings. And they say things like, I love chocolate cake. Now, you don't love chocolate cake, you want to eat it. And that's very different from loving it. If you were a piece of chocolate cake and you heard someone standing nearby saying, I just love chocolate cake, you better worry about yourself. You can imagine someone who loved chocolate cake. They just took care of it and carried it around carefully and saw to it that it was in good condition and so forth and so on. But you get the idea. So now the problem is what you bring to the word love when you say love is God. And the understanding of love, where it is the power of righteousness and goodness and beauty and all things good. See, that sense, you have to go to God to get the definition. And so when we say God is love, you have to be careful with that, the logic of that statement. It looks like an identity statement, but it's not. An identity statement, if A is B, then B is A, isn't it? Right? The statement God is love is an essence statement, not an identity statement, an essence statement. It's a statement that tells you what is the fundamental nature of God. And that is love. And love is creative power for good. Now we have to talk about spirit this afternoon some more about it. Important to understand that. And so when you go to Exodus 3:14, is it? And Moses wants to know who you are, because he's being sent on a pretty tough mission, and he'd better know who it is. And so you get that wonderful statement in answer to the question, who are you? I am that I am. Now, not I am who I am, or I am what I am. The translators really struggle with that verse. And it's better sometimes that translators don't have too many ideas, and they might just actually translate what it says, And in many of our translations, you can just sort of see them putting their elbow on the table and saying, now let me tell you what I think about that. And the wording there in the old translations is quite good. I am that I am. I am that I am. That's ultimate creative power. That's my being depends only on my being, nothing else. And that power is for good. So when God finished creation, what does it say? He looked at it and he said, boy, is that good. That is really good. That's love. See, love is set to produce what is good. I've put some wording up here. Love, you love something if your will is set to promote its good. So if you love your geranium, what do? You don't go out and slap it around, do you? No, you try to make sure it's in the light, and a certain time you give it water and maybe a little food, and take care of it. That's love. If you love your pet rock, you take care of it. That's the general nature of love. And you really want to, and that's not what you have towards chocolate cake. A person of love is one whose overall orientation is toward good for all affected by him or her. That is a person of love. A holy person now, I want to, in all of my meanderings, I try to connect the dots now, okay? Because a holy person is a person pervaded by love. That's a holy person. It isn't a person who knows what's wrong with everyone and is prepared to tell them. Right? That might be appropriate. If it's something you do genuinely to help people and you can do it in a way that will help them, okay. Jake.
Yes. How would you differentiate the just love, as you described it, between what a lot of our culture says, I'm in love with this person or that person?
They're in lust. The way that's usually used. And they get married in lust. And then they fall out of lust and into lust with someone else. And they never had the idea what love is. Now, there are exceptions, okay? But unfortunately, that's the usual meaning. And so then that's filled with all kinds of illusions. When you get married in love, under God, that's a different story. For example, now, you are set to do what is good for that other person, and you will never set out to hurt them. You will be there for them in the way that the traditional wedding vows state. Sickness is health, rich for poor. Now that just about takes your breath away because you realize you're saying something you can't do. But that's why marriage is a sacrament. Bishop Fulton Sheen wrote a book long ago called Three to Get Married. You better believe it. And if you do, it will turn out to be something so unbelievably wonderful. Because it will be love. But love is not something you fall into or out of. Love is a set of the will. And when we get married, we say something to another person that is just unbelievably holy. And, you know, that's why we need good marriage teaching and ceremonies, is because most of us, when we get married, haven't the foggiest idea what we're doing. So we need some real good words to take with us into a marriage. And they will help us. That's love. That's love. And you get married with love in that way, then you never need to think someone will be able from the outside to break it apart, because it is a union of wills under God. Now what they sing about is, it's not it. It's, you know, they have a very high divorce rate up in Oklahoma, and people talk about, well, that's the Bible Belt and all that, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and so on. I think it's the country music. Did you ever listen to those songs?
There are Oklahomans in this room, sir.
I have a word for you. No, those songs are self-torturing things. You know, come, stick your finger in my eye again because I love you so much. See, that's why Peter says, beware of fleshly lusts that war against the soul. They will tear you to pieces. That is the nature of desire. And that's why you never want to confuse desire and love. Now, if desire is subordinated to love, then you're in good shape. Because love will act for what is good and bring desire under subordination to what is good. But desire itself doesn't give a flip about good. It just says, I want that. See, I want that. Now, the will, we have to talk more about the will, and I'm hoping you will read the William James piece, and we'll have a good discussion about that. The will never says, I want that. The will always says, I wonder if that's best. The child drags the parents into the store and says, I want that. And the parent says, you know, that's not a good choice, honey. And the kid says, I want that. And maybe the parent finally says, okay, you can have it. 10 minutes later, the trinket is broken. The kid is mad at mommy and says, "Why did you let me do that?" You ever hear a kid say that? See, they're learning about desire and about will. And it's so important for us to help children come to understand. We don't want to be hard on them about it. And they have to learn that from the inside. So you have to make careful judgments about different children. They take it in different ways. And you don't want to make a supercilious little judgmental schnit out of a 5-year-old kid. You know. So, I mean, desire is a good thing. It's just we often get it under control too late. See, if you didn't have desires when you come into the world, you wouldn't survive. You have wants and you fulfill them, and that allows you to stay alive, but you're not meant to stay in that shape. Love comes in, and love says your will needs to be directed by what is good. And then growing up means that you come to the place to where you can look at your desires and say, I don't need that. But now some people can't face down a Twinkie or a donut. True, isn't it? We're going to do a little fasting tomorrow. And I want to teach a little bit about it in the morning so that you know what it is. Yes, ma'am.
If I may ask
You're
a
next.
clarifying question. So desire subordinated to love is primarily desire for the good. either
That's right. Love is directed
either
towards
for
what?
myself
Yes.
or towards the other person.
Yes, indeed.
So when I've told my children over the years when they are watching some kind of movie,
I'm not quite hearing you. I'm
if
sorry.
I speak to my children, let's say, and they're watching some kind of movie I might be disapproving of as a mother, and I say to them, "Is this a good movie?" And they say, "It's not bad."
Well, then
I
that.
say, "But is it good?"
That's an important distinction, and you should at that point have a discussion. And at that point you want to listen to them to find out what they mean and help them. This is one reason why you need to let children have some money earlier on and let them be responsible for spending it so that they can think about how they wish they hadn't done that.
Right, right.
And you let them learn and you teach them how to choose. And the will always says, until it becomes enslaved, and that's an important point, because an addiction is addiction is in a person who has signed their will over to their desires. So you can abandon your will. And many people in our culture today do not know that they have a will. They think their will is their feelings. So you let them grow and you teach them, and you listen to them, and you enable them to learn, and that's really how all education works. It's learning how to pray, learning how to witness, learning all the things, learning how to give and so forth. All that's learning because it requires will, and what we want to do is see the will developed into good character under the direction of what is good and truthful. And so it's a project of growing up. Yes, sir.
We have some pastries out there that we need to face down.
There are some pastries out that are calling you.
So 10-minute break.
You think 10 minutes will be enough to deal with the pastries?
We don't want to elongate the temptation.
Okay, come back in 10 minutes.